Dear all, I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome to all who have joined us today for this insightful webinar. This webinar is a platform for the exchange of ideas and a gateway to new possibilities. I would like to hand over the session to Professor Pankaj Jain, Chair of the India Center, and request him to introduce us to our Speaker of the Month.
Thank you, Sanchari. It's a great delight for me and for the India Center and for Flame University to welcome Professor Salvatore Babones all the way from Australia, who is an American sociologist, but in Australia for many years. I will read his bio and then he will present his webinar. Professor Salvatore Babones is an associate professor at the University of Sydney and the executive director of the Indian Century Roundtable. He is a quantitative comparative sociologist whose current research focuses on the political sociology of democracy. He is the author or editor of 14 books and several dozen academic research articles. He earned his MS in statistics and PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins University near Washington, D.C., Baltimore. His 2018 book, The New Authoritarianism, was named among the year's best on politics by the Wall Street Journal. He is currently researching a book on Indian democracy and frequently in the news and on social media. So delighted to welcome you, sir. All yours.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be speaking today on how international rankings mischaracterize India, and I'll start with some general observations about Indian democracy. It's often said that India is the world's largest democracy, and of course that's true, but from a social science standpoint, and especially from a quantitative social science standpoint, that's not very interesting. In fact, size of countries unrelated to level of democracy. We have big democracies like the United States. We have small democracies like Luxembourg. We have big dictatorships like China, and we have small dictatorships like Equatorial Guinea, right? There's no actual statistical relationship, no correlation whatsoever between size of country and level of democracy. What's interesting about India is not that it's the world's largest democracy, it's that it's by far the world's poorest democracy. Now, many Indians get upset when I call their country poor. I'm very sorry about that. But the fact is, India has a GDP per capita of around $2,250 per year. To put that in context, Australia is roughly around $60,000 a year. The US is upwards of $70,000 a year. India is far poorer than most of the world's democracies. And if we look for well-institutionalized democracies, and by that I simply mean a country that's had elections for 4 decades, there's no cutoff for how far we should go back, but let's just say 4 decades, a country that's been a democracy since the 1980s, you have to look to countries that are 20 times as rich as India to find other democracies. If you lower that threshold a little and you say, well, countries that have been in democracy for at least 3 decades, you're still looking at countries that are an order of magnitude, 10 times as rich as India. Now, of course, there are many countries that are poor countries today that have democracies today, but we don't know how long those democracies will last. And in fact, if history is any guide, then most of them will cycle in and out of democracy multiple times before democracy finally catches on. India is by far the world's poorest country that has a well-established record of routine elections, of peaceful transfers in power between parties of different ideologies, with no real questioning of its basic democratic institutions. Now, I know there's been a lot of questioning in the news media and in academia about the quality of India's democracy. Let's leave that aside for the moment and simply focus on the fact of India's democracy, the fact of elections. No other country comes close in terms of GDP per capita. I might go further and say India is the world's only post-colonial country, the only major post-colonial country to have remained a democracy throughout its entire post-colonial history, which is to say that every other country that achieved independence from a European or Japanese, Asian colonial power had its democracy at some point fail. Now, there are a couple of minor examples, minor there are a couple of minor exceptions to that. For example, Belize, but Belize only became an independent country in the 1970s. It was only quasi-independent at that point. For a while, it retained the British monarch as its head of state. So it had a slow transition into independence. And other island states similarly could be characterized as having been democracies throughout their entire independent history. But when we look at major continental countries, India is literally the only country in the world to have achieved independence and remained a democracy. India is also the only well-institutionalized democracy in all of Eurasia, between Israel in the far west and South Korea in the far east. That entire Eurasian landmass in between those two countries has not had a history of well-institutionalized democracy other than India. It's a tough neighborhood. Now, if we put these variables into a regression model and we start to ask, what are the predictors of democracy? All three of these, being poor, being post-colonial, and being Eurasian, would all three be quantitative variables that would predict that a country would not remain a democracy. Put all those three together, and it's extraordinarily unlikely that India would have become a democracy in 1947 and remained a democracy for the rest of its history. And in fact, that finding is a bedrock finding, one of the earliest findings of quantitative political science. When quantitative political science was first developing in the 1990s, some of the earliest studies concerned predictions about democratic success. And India was already 25 years ago, recognized to be a major statistical outlier. In fact, from a statistical standpoint, India is, and I'm going to say this very carefully, India is the world's most extraordinarily successful democracy. It may not be the world's most successful democracy. We could debate that, whether some European country is most successful, some North American country, maybe some Asian country. We all have our subjective evaluations. We all have our feelings and emotions engaged in these. But from a purely objective standpoint, India's democracy is extraordinary in the sense that an ordinary democracy, if I look around the world for countries that have been democracies for 50 years, just a simple rough cut, where in the world can I find countries that have been democracies for 50 years? Well, they're all in Western Europe or North America, or the odd case of Japan and East Asia, and that's it. Plus India. Oh, I'm sorry, Australia, New Zealand, which are themselves settler colonial societies, plus India. Okay, so India is not an ordinarily successful democracy. It's not a rich European heritage developed country. It is an extraordinarily successful democracy because it is extraordinary when it comes to democracies. Yet, we all know the recent accusations about the quality of Indian democracy. The Economist Intelligence Unit says that India is, quote, a flawed democracy. The Economist rates India worse than South Africa, which is a violent one-party state. Now, we all admire the nobility of South Africa's transition from apartheid to majority rule. But whatever we may think of Nelson Mandela as a great independence leader, the fact is that South Africa today is essentially a corrupt one-party dictatorship, not an individual dictatorship, but a one-party dictatorship where violence is endemic and violence in the political process is endemic. The Economist says that India is worse. Freedom House is the American semi-official think tank, largely funded by the US government and closely linked foundations in the United States, rates India now as, quote unquote, partially free. Now, partly that's a statistical issue. The Freedom House simply has numbers on its scale that to them represent the threshold between free and partly free. And India in the last couple of years has just dipped below that threshold in the partly free. Nonetheless, it is symbolic. The Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is maybe the most, not maybe, certainly the most scientific of the democracy rankings organizations, VDEM for short, Varieties of Democracy, rates India as an electoral autocracy. Just a step, actually two rankings, but decimal place, a sliver above Myanmar, where a military junta overthrew the civilian government 2 years ago. And this ranking of Myanmar is post-coup Myanmar. Pre-coup Myanmar, with the very limited democracy it had before the military takeover, was rated above India by VDEM, the Rise of Democracy Institute. In fact, in its latest report, VDEM has put India on a par with China as two forms of autocracy. India as being an electoral autocracy and China as being an unelected autocracy. But nonetheless, the report throughout uses this metaphor of India and China being on the same level when it comes to not being democracies. Look further afield and it gets even worse. Reporters Sans Frontières Press Freedom Index rates India below Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is a part of communist China where there's no press freedom, where the only independent newspaper had its presses, Apple News had its presses smashed by government-linked gangsters, where the publisher was abducted into mainland China in accordance with the new security law. The two newspapers have been closed down. There's no dissent allowed in Hong Kong today. The South China Morning Post operates on a very short leash, and yet it's rated better than India for press freedom. Similarly, India has been rated the most dangerous country in the world for women. It's been rated the worst country in the world for social hostility to religion. A few years ago, it was rated the second highest country in the world for genocide risk. It's been rated the most racist country in the world. I mean, how can all of these be true when India is the only real democracy in the developing world? The answer, I think, comes down to realizing that India is not just the only democracy in the developing world, it is the only developing country among democracies. And so India faces a lot of scrutiny in ways that other developing countries do not, and it faces a lot of scrutiny in ways that other democracies do not. India becomes a target for criticism precisely because it is the only democracy in the developing world. Let me give you the example of Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is not a developing country, but let's focus on Hong Kong for a minute. Why does Reporters Sans Frontières rate Hong Kong better than India for journalists? Well, you have to be a journalist in Hong Kong in order to be able to rate Hong Kong for Reporters Sans Frontières. It's fundamentally a survey of what journalists in the country believe about their country's press. Well, if you're a journalist in Hong Kong, you have to be regime friendly. If you were a regime unfriendly journalist in Hong Kong, you would already have lost your job. If you were to go to Myanmar, if you were a political scientist who was an activist supporting Aung San Suu Kyi and opposed the military junta in Myanmar, you would no longer have a job at a university in Myanmar. Now, India, of course, being a democracy, is an environment where critics of the government, not just the government of the day, critics of the country itself, critics of the state, of the system in India, are able to present their viewpoints, are able to flourish, and as a result, are captured in international surveys in a way that in other developing countries that are not democracies, those intellectuals are excluded from these analyses. To see that that's true, let's look at the origins of the three main democracy indices. So the first one is The Economist. The Economist democracy rankings are produced by an expert panel. Now, if any of you are not familiar with The Economist has always, for the 160 plus years of its existence, used a corporate authorship model, meaning that articles in The Economist are not authored by anybody. They're authored as being from The Economist. That is, they're speaking in a corporate sense in the name of the magazine. So The Economist doesn't say who's on its expert panel. I've spoken to some former Economist employees who say they were on the expert panel, and they told me the process was essentially a gathering of the minds at the Economist research unit to discuss what they knew about each country and to place it, to give a score to it on The Economist rankings. The Economist, which ranks countries based on the opinions of its own experts. That is, they're not doing a survey of people in India. They're not doing a survey of political scientists. They're just asking themselves, the editors, journalists, employees, analysts at The Economist in the broad organization. They actually rate India best of the three major rankings organizations. They rate India 46 out of 167. Now, 46 is not great. If you kind of add up the numbers, if you assume that they're ranking almost all of the European Union countries higher than India, they're ranking North American countries higher than India, they're ranking Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan higher than India, South Korea, then pretty much what you end up with is India sits just outside the first world on The Economist rankings. Not great. We could debate that. We could argue with that. But The Economist, which is ranking India based on the opinions of its own expert staff, are putting India as being among the best democracies or the best countries for democracy outside the developed world. Again, we might or might not accept that, but that's not so bad. Let's look at Freedom House. Freedom House is that US government-sponsored think tank. They survey academics, think tankers, and human rights activists. Total, they have 128 analysts and 50 quote-unquote advisors. They don't explain on their methodology documentation the different roles of analysts and advisors. I suspect that they have analysts in-house or part of the broader network, but if they have to deal with countries that are much more obscure to them, so for example, there may not be expertise within Freedom House on far-flung, relatively small population countries like Lesotho or the Solomon Islands, they might consult an outside expert. Freedom House rates India a bit worse, 77th out of 194. But again, Freedom House is going to outside experts and getting a lower ranking for India. But the best, most scientific democracy organization, ranking organization of all, is VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Institute. VDEM is, in fact, a university-based institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. It is run out of the political science department. It's funded by the European Research Council. A lot of people like to say, oh, there's George Soros money at VDEM. Really, those rumors are baseless. George Soros may have occasionally funded a seminar held at VDEM or participation of a VDEM scholar in a meeting. But fundamentally, the VDEM rankings, their main source of funding is the European Research Council. This is a truly academic ranking source. Reflecting their academic origins, it's the best documented ranking source. They publish a highly detailed methodology document. They publish all their data in very high detail. And if you want the original survey data, if you're an academic, you can apply and get access to their original survey data. It's the best organization for transparency by far of the three major rankings organizations. It's also widely respected so that its rankings and its data are used by the World Bank for its governance indicators. They're used by the U.S. Agency for International Development for its governance indicators that then go into international bond ratings for developing countries. VDEM, in fact, is also used by other democracy rankings. You may have heard of, for example, the Cato Institute Fraser Center Human Freedom Index. Sounds like a completely independent ranking system, yet almost all of the data for the Cato Institute Human Freedom Index come from VDEM. They simply take the VDEM variables, weight them differently, ignore the ones they're not interested in, foreground the ones they are interested in them, and produce a new ranking, but based on VDEM data. Other ranking systems also incorporate VDEM because it really is the most sophisticated, best funded, most nonpartisan rankings organization around. VDEM does not base its rankings on a group of experts sitting in Sweden who decide the fate of other countries' democracies. Now, it is true that the rankings methodology established by VDEM was established by a group of mainly European political scientists, and so it reflects European norms. One thing that's been an issue in India has been that VDEM does not penalize a country for having a hereditary head of state or having an official state religion. And there are obvious reasons why, because Sweden has a hereditary head of state, Sweden has a official state religion, and as a result, in the mental architecture of the people who created the VDEM rankings, these things don't preclude a democracy, because in their minds, this is what they are, and they feel they are a democracy. So there are ways we can quibble with the broader construction of the VDEM index. But when it comes to its actual data, its questions, and there are several hundred questions asked by VDEM, not several hundred, I think there are over 100 questions asked by VDEM. Those questions are answered specifically by political scientists, and specifically by political scientists in the country being surveyed. So, for example, India's rating, not its ranking on VDEM, its rating, meaning the actual score it gets on VDEM, which then goes into determining India's score versus all the others, will determine India's place. India's rating on VDEM is primarily determined by Indian political scientists. In fact, VDEM tells us that 85% of its respondents are political science professors. Roughly 2/3 of them come from the country being evaluated. Now, that's across the entire world. For a country like India, where there's a very large academic infrastructure, I suspect it's greater than 2/3 coming from the country being evaluated, because remember that 2/3 figure is a global figure. We can hardly expect that countries like Solomon Islands, Lesotho, Togo, would be evaluated by professors in their own country, because there aren't extensive university systems in those countries. So most of the countries that are being evaluated by outside experts would be smaller, relatively more obscure countries. I can't say for certainty because I don't have the data from VDEM, but everything I know about VDEM leads me to believe that India's proportion of internal experts would be much higher than 2/3. Whatever the number, it's certain that more than half, and likely that more than 2/3, probably around 3/4 of the people evaluating India in the VDEM rankings are themselves Indian political science professors. And VDEM ranks India 108th out of 179 countries. And this is the background for that famous or notorious statement I made that's long since been excerpted out of context, that it's India's intellectuals who are anti-India. When I said that, if you listen to the entire interview with Rajdeep Sardesai, this was last October at the India Today conclave. If you listen to the whole interview, you'll hear that it wasn't an accusation I was making about Indian intellectuals. It was an explanation I was giving, that the reason VDEM ranks India so low is not that Western imperialists have ranked India badly. That's the standard narrative you get from people in India who are upset about the rankings. The actual explanation is that Indian intellectuals have ranked India badly and reported their negative views of Indian democracy to VDEM, which is then publishing its report that it's reported in the Indian press. The ultimate origin of VDEM's negative ranking of India is India's own political scientists. And note how that differs from The Economist. The Economist, which relies entirely on Western experts, or at least on its own staff, who are almost all Western. The Economist ranks India 46th in the world. VDEM, which relies on Indian experts, ranks India 108th. All right. Let's take a look then more closely at the origins of VDEM's poor ranking for India. Partly, it's due to the negative of subjective assessments of India's own intellectuals, and partly it's due to the structure of the VDEM rankings themselves. Let me walk you through this. The VDEM index is calculated on the basis of 5 sub-indices. That is, the overall electoral democracy index is an arithmetic function of 5 sub-indices. Now, it's not a simple averaging of the 5 sub-indices. It's slightly more complicated than that, but fundamentally, the 5 sub-indices combine to form the overall index. Those 5 sub-indices are elected officials, universal suffrage, clean elections, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. And I'm going to walk you through each of these because two of them are purely objective, which is to say, are people in the country elected? It's a simple yes or no. And can everyone in the country vote? That's a simple yes or no. These are purely objective indicators of democracy. Then VDEM has a partially objective component, which is to say it's objective, but they're questions answered by experts. So these are objective information being provided by experts. And that's the subindex on clean elections. And then there are two subindices that are almost entirely subjective, which is to say they're based entirely on the expert's opinions, not the expert knowledge, expert opinion. And this is freedom of association and freedom of expression. So let me walk you through these five subindices of VDEM to illustrate the challenges here that India faces. First is elected officials, the first of the five subindices. 131 countries were given perfect scores on a scale from 0 to 1. They were given a perfect 1.0 on elected officials. Those countries with perfect scores for having elected officials include Belarus, Cuba, Libya, Palestinian territories, Russia, Syria, and Vietnam. Now, the reason those countries get perfect scores for elected officials is that technically, according to their constitutions, everybody's elected. They're not hereditary. They're not chosen by a party cabal. Theoretically, the Constitution makes provision for elections, and so they get perfect scores. India, interestingly, does not get a perfect score for elected officials. India gets a score of 0.996, which is trivially short of a perfect score, but that 0.996 is due to the fact that until the 2019 elections, the Anglo-Indian community was represented in the Lok Sabha by two members who were appointed by the President of India. Now, that's been changed in the next, that little discrepancy will disappear in 2024. And so India will join the ranks of Vietnam, Russia, and Cuba as having a perfect score for elected officials. But note that 131 countries in the world, that is more than half the world's countries, about 2/3, get perfect scores for elected officials. Now, how is that popular? How is that possible? It's possible because, and I'm going to quote here from the VDEM documentation. The VDEM documentation notes that for this subindex, quote, a popular election is minimally defined and also includes sham elections with limited suffrage and no competition. In other words, that's their words, sham elections count as perfect score for having elected officials. And thus, a country like Vietnam, where, unlike China, the Communist Party in Vietnam doesn't just appoint the government. The Communist Party in Vietnam appoints candidates who then run for positions in the Vietnamese government. Of course, they don't allow any other candidates. You must be endorsed by the Communist Party of Vietnam to be a candidate. But because they run elections in accordance with their constitution, Vietnam gets a perfect score for elected officials. All right. Going to the next of the five, number 2 is universal suffrage. The question here is, in the country involved, is everybody allowed to vote? Subject to a few exceptions. They do allow exceptions for convicted felons. But are all citizens allowed to vote? Well, again, 174 countries out of 179. I mean, virtually every country in the world, every country except 5, get perfect scores for universal suffrage. That includes all the countries I mentioned before, Russia, Cuba, Vietnam, but also China, Hong Kong, Iran, North Korea, the Gaza Strip, Myanmar, and Venezuela. In other words, even a country like, forget China, North Korea, which has been ruled by the Kim family ever since independence, which is a one-party communist, not only a communist dictatorship, a single-family dictatorship in North Korea. Because the North Korean constitution says that everyone is allowed to vote regardless of wealth or education or sex, North Korea gets a perfect score for universal suffrage. So does India. But India and North Korea on this index, sub-index, are exactly the same. They both have 100% elected officials. And again, VDEM has an explanation in its methodological documentation. It notes that this sub-index takes into account only, and I'm going to quote, legal de jure restrictions, not restrictions that may be operative in practice. In other words, as long as the Constitution says you're elected, you're universal suffrage, you have universal suffrage. All right, well, I go through this exercise not just to point out how silly VDEM is, but to point out a profound statistical problem with VDEM. We're coming out of the two completely objective elements, 2 out of 5, that are completely objective. And out of those 2 out of 5 that are completely objective, Russia has a perfect score, Vietnam has a perfect score, Cuba has a perfect score. There's nothing democratic about these countries, but they're on a par with India on these 2 objective measures. In fact, India is slightly less because of those 2 seats for the Anglo-Indian community. But India, United States, Germany, and North Korea are all on a par. Well, not North Korea. North Korea didn't have elected officials. So India, Vietnam, Germany, and the United States are all on a par on the objective criteria. The result is that all of the cross-national variability in the VDEM total index, all of it comes from variability in the expert opinions. You may as well, from a statistical standpoint, you may as well not have the objective sub-indices because everyone just gets a perfect score anyway. So why bother having them? Statistically, it makes no difference whether you have the objective indicators or you don't have them. The relative ranking of countries would remain the same. Okay. Now, in a well-designed index, you would have objective indicators for, are people really being elected? Are people really allowed to vote? And those might balance the subjective indicators. So if you imagine a jurisdiction where people had, let's think of Hong Kong in the 1990s, even Hong Kong in the early 2000s, a country that has full freedom of expression, full freedom of organization, a very free environment, but no democracy. Well, what we would want in our index is when comparing Hong Kong to India, we would want India to score very high objectively. After all, it's holding elections. Hong Kong to score very low objectively. It doesn't have elections. And then if Hong Kong gets rated very high for its subjective freedoms, well, that might balance out the lack of elections and bring Hong Kong up. What we have instead is a situation where Hong Kong and India are both getting perfect scores objectively. And the only differentiating factor is that subjective comparison, with the result that everything is driven by the subjective feelings of the people doing the evaluation. In India's case, India's own political scientists. Okay, that's where we're standing coming out of the first 2 fully objective measures. Then we have the third of the VDEM, I'll put it this way, the third of the VDEM sub-indices. And that is clean elections. So this is rating the quality of the elections, not just the fact that the Constitution says you should have an election. Clean elections is supposed to rate the quality of the elections. But even here, in this supposedly objective indicator of how clean the elections are, no one thought to ask, is there actually any real competition? That is, if you look at I think there are 8 subcomponents of clean elections. If you look at the subcomponents, none of them ask, is it possible for anyone else to win other than an approved government party? And I think the reason this isn't asked is that the people making up the index in Sweden were not imagining the difference between democracies and non-democracies. They were imagining, if I want to compare Sweden to Italy, both are democracies, how clean are their elections? And they never imagined to ask, are the elections meaningful at all? I mean, after all, we already heard that in the first two objective components, all they care about is de jure are their elections. De jure, can everybody vote, even if they're sham elections in which nobody's really allowed to vote. Okay, so we get to the Clean Elections Index. On clean elections, India has been savaged. It's declined from 59th in the world, not great, in 2014. 59th in the world in 2014 would already place it as not one of the better democracies in the world, down to 91st in the world today, in 2022 rankings, which came out in 2023. Okay. VDEM ranked the 2019 elections in India as being less, quote unquote, free and fair than the 2021 Legislative Council elections in Hong Kong. That's right, an election in Hong Kong where only government-approved candidates can run was rated as being more free and fair than the 2019 central government election in India. Now, obviously, that's crazy. So how could you come at a result like that? Well, if you look at the specific questions asked, the questions are not actually about the realistic opportunity of people to unseat their rulers. Instead, the questions hinge on technical criteria. For example, was there violence at the polls? Well, we all know there's poll violence in India. It's not as widespread as often reported in the news, but nonetheless, it's real, it's there. People do get killed during elections in India. Nobody gets killed in an election in Hong Kong. Why? Because it's a sham election in which everybody knows the outcome from the beginning. Why would there be violence at the polls when there's only one candidate? Vote buying. We all know there's some vote buying in India. I hear differing reports. Some people say vote buying is widespread. Some people say, no, those are stories from decades ago of villages. Whether that's true or not, I'm not here to judge whether there's vote buying in India or not. I'm sorry, how much vote buying there is in India. Do I believe there's more vote buying in India than in Hong Kong? Yes, absolutely. Why? Because in India, it means something to buy someone's vote. I mean, if you buy someone's vote, you could be elected. In Hong Kong, you can't buy anybody's vote. There's only one candidate, right? So again, on these technical criteria, Hong Kong ranks better than India. Is there a complete electoral roll? Well, in Hong Kong, absolutely. It's a first world country. Everybody's registered. Everyone's properly noted. The electoral roll is complete. Now, it's true that the Chinese Communist Party has been consciously attempting to change the demographics of Hong Kong by bringing in mainlanders and registering them as citizens in Hong Kong, but it's all done with administrative efficiency. There are no questions. When any one person shows up at the polls, there's no questions about that person's citizenship and right to vote. In India, there are real controversies. There are controversies, especially in West Bengal and Assam, over the status of people who are originally from East Bengal and the questions of their citizenship. These are legitimate questions. Nobody knows the proper answer as to every individual's voting status. There are allegations that people have been prevented from voting. And inevitably, with the size of the immigration that's occurred over the last 70 years from East Bengal, Bangladesh now, inevitably, the electoral roll is not going to be accurate. Simple poverty suggests that in different parts of India, there will be problems with the electoral roll. In Hong Kong, again, you don't have any choice who to vote for, but your name will certainly appear on the electoral roll. There's no doubt of the administrative efficiency of the authorities in Hong Kong. Are there irregularities at the poll, meaning lapses of procedure? Do people not follow appropriate polling? Again, in India, certainly in all of India, 1.4 billion people spread across an entire continent, yes, certainly there are going to be polling places in which there are irregularities of procedure, in which procedures are not followed the way they should be. I mean, my own country in the United States, which is 20, 30, 40 times as rich as India, There are voting irregularities in the United States. We've seen that in the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, with all the allegations on both sides of voting irregularities. Inevitable in a robust democracy, there are voting irregularities, but not in Hong Kong, because there's no real democracy in Hong Kong. The bizarre result coming out of VDEM, however, is that Hong Kong's elections are rated as cleaner than India's elections. So now we have the two completely objective criteria. Are officials elected, and are there any legal restrictions on voting? India is already no better than dictatorships like Vietnam and Russia. And now in the third one, on clean elections, India is worse than Hong Kong. The result is that everything, when it comes to India's ranking, comes down to the final two categories, which are freedom of expression and freedom of association, which are almost entirely subjective. That is, they're based on the respondent, the political scientist's opinion about how free India is. They're not based on any objective measure of freedom. They're based on a simple opinion. So in 2022, India was ranked 116th in the world for freedom of association. Now, lest you think this is a BJP versus Congress issue, an anti-Modi intellectual issue, India was already rated 92nd in the world way back in 2014. Okay, so this is not something new. It's deteriorated slightly, but not dramatically like the clean elections index is deteriorated. Okay. India's own intellectuals, when asked a series of questions about freedom of association, ranked India lower than they ranked, for example, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. And in fact, to give the respondents, because subjective questions are very hard to evaluate, are people really allowed to associate with who they choose? It's very difficult to say. There are no objective criteria. So political scientists were actually given a series of examples of countries to represent each level. And India was ranked below Mugabe's Zimbabwe, but above Francisco Franco's Spain. Now, for those of you who don't know, the white terror police regime that was Francisco Franco's Spain, there was no freedom of association under Franco in Spain and the Falangists in Spain. India does better than that, but worse than Zimbabwe. But then by far the worst, the place where India has dropped from, again, being not so good, 61st in the world, down to 130th in the world. This is 130th out of 179 countries, is freedom of expression. Now, I'm not Indian. I don't have the challenge of seeing whether or not I can freely express my opinions in India. However, India's intellectuals, again, this is India's political scientists telling us, say that personal freedom in India is lower than in Pakistan, which I find face validity very low, but far worse than in Indonesia. And Indonesia, I point out, recently declared Sharia law. And yet, again, it boggles the mind. I mean, if the BJP were this year to declare something they called Hindutva law and subject everyone in the country to a interpretation of personal law drawn from ancient holy books, I can't imagine the conflagration that would break out in India and abroad about this. Yet in Indonesia, that declaration of Sharia law didn't harm its rating for personal freedom, freedom of expression. Now, how is that possible? I suspect it's possible because if you are a political science professor in Indonesia, you're probably a conservative Muslim, or you would not have been allowed to become a political science professor in Indonesia, which means that you, as a political science professor in Indonesia, don't feel that it's oppressive to impose Sharia law. You may be in favor of it. Whereas India, which is a true democracy, in India, it is, of course, not acceptable to impose a religious view on other people. Whenever there's motion in that direction, it is severe. There's severe pushback against it. Okay. So according to India's experts, India's freedom of expression is one of the worst in the world. And specifically, the one statistic I find interesting about this, freedom of expression is not a single number. It's a series of individual questions. The one on government censorship of the press, I found particularly incredible. India's political scientists believe that government censorship of the press in India today is the same as Iranian political scientists believe it is in Iran. Now, of course, in Iran, there's no free press at all. The government controls everything that can be published in the newspapers or on television. Well, Indian political scientists feel for themselves the same level of repression that Iranian political scientists say they feel about Iran. Once again, though, could you be a political scientist in Iran if you were anti-regime? And I think that's an obvious question to be asked. All right, so let's say the experts are right. I mean, I'm not Indian. I can't know. Even if you're Indian, you can't know because everyone can only see subjectively their own place in society. It's very difficult to get quantitative metrics on these things. I have some quantitative metrics on academic freedom. I'll leave that if anyone wants to talk about them. But in most cases, except for press freedom and academic freedom, it's hard to get any real quantitative indicators. So none of us can really know. All you can know personally is, do you feel free? Do the people you talk to feel free? You can't really objectively know whether people broadly construed in India are free to express themselves. So we have to rely on expert opinion. Let's say the experts are right. Let's say that freedom in India really is so badly constrained that it's on a par with some of the most repressive regimes in the world. Now, as someone who reads the Indian media every day, I don't believe that freedom in India is on a par with Iran, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Vietnam. I just don't believe this. But I have no quantitative basis on which to deny it. So let's say that it's true. Even so, if VDEM were well designed, India's objective history of holding elections and having turnover in power, when people lose elections, they leave. I mean, even Indira Gandhi, when she lost her election in 1977, she left office. Right? The only unprecedented in the world for a third world leader who suspended civil rights to hold an election and then step down when she lost. It's extraordinary. Okay, but even if India has such a terrible situation for freedoms, its record of electoral success should balance that out. Right? So if India does have elections, but has terrible freedoms, India's democracy score should end up in the middle. The reason it doesn't end up in the middle is that everybody gets that perfect score on the objective indicators. The only differentiation is the subjective ones. As a result, poor methodology combines with what I strongly suspect are personal biases into a solidification of a perception around the world that India is no longer a democratic country. And that perception is solidified through what I like to call the charisma of statistics. Because there's a number put on Indian democracy, and that number is 108th in the world. When something happens, like the accusations we've just seen of a murder of a Canadian citizen of Indian origin in Canada, when such an accusation arises, we take it seriously. Why? Well, we have a number. India is no longer a democracy. VDEM tells us that. India is an autocracy. And it's the sort of thing that autocracies do. In fact, all the reporting on the murder in Canada has cited the murder of a Saudi Arabian journalist in Turkey. Many have cited the murder of Russian dissidents in England. Why are they citing those? Because through the charisma of statistics, most reporters, most analysts in Western countries now accept that India is on a par with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Russia when it comes to the quality of its democratic institutions. They believe it because it's not just an opinion, it's a number. VDEM gives us a number. The others give us numbers as well. VDEM gives us the best documented number. And that creates a mental impression in us that then primes us to be ready for these kinds of negative stories. Look, it's tempting to believe that Western institutions are simply anti-Modi, anti-BJP, or more broadly, anti-India. That's a narrative I hear a lot in India. In reality, it's something a bit different. Yes, it's Indian intellectuals telling us negative things about India that may or may not be warranted. Yes, there's bad methodology. But fundamentally, the problem is the information-poor environment in which Western debates about India are conducted. Let me give you an example of that. I'm American. My own president, Joe Biden, said last year, around this time last year, when he was promoting a voting rights bill, he said that Republican-controlled states, and he specifically mentioned Texas and Florida, Republican-controlled states like Texas and Florida would be, and I'm quoting here, no better than the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century if they didn't pass his voting rights legislation. He said elections would no longer matter and America would no longer be a democracy if his legislation was not passed. Well, his legislation failed. What do all of you think about American democracy? Do you think it's now no better than Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany? Or do you probably think that he was just using hyperbole and you ignore it? I suspect that very few of you actually take my own president at his word. This is not an academic expert. This is the president of the United States who said that Texas and Florida would be no better than Stalin's Soviet Union or Hitler's Nazi Germany. But we don't believe it. Why? Because we've been to Texas. We've been to Disney World. You know, all of you read American news. All of you are aware. All of you have friends in America. All of you have relatives in America. You're very aware of what's happening in the United States, with the result that you have a very strong basis on which to form your own judgment about American democracy. Just like I watch Indian news media, just like I read Indian newspapers, you watch American news media, you read American newspapers. And so you have the basis on which to form your own judgment, and thus you don't take these kinds of statements seriously. However, for an American or British person, when Rahul Gandhi goes abroad and tells us that India is no longer a democracy, we perceive it as a major leader of the opposition, the most prominent opponent to the current prime minister, telling us that India is no longer a democracy. Why shouldn't we believe it? I mean, when Vladimir Zelensky comes and tells us something about Ukraine, we take it at face value. He's a Ukrainian president, right? When people come and talk to us about their countries, we generally take it at face value because we know very little about those countries. Now, of course, if someone came and told me Japan is not a democracy, I might, question it because I would know a lot about Japan. I may have visited there. Very few Americans have visited India. Very few Americans who are not of Indian origin have visited India. When they do visit India, they visit primarily for cultural tourism, not because they're interested in the political system. No ordinary American reads an Indian newspaper. No ordinary American can name any Indian leader other than Narendra Modi. In fact, Mr. Modi's own name recognition in the United States only this year broke above 50%. Before this year, most Americans could not name the Indian prime minister. Never mind any states in India, never mind know anything about India's population. Probably the only Indian that most Americans could name before this year was Mahatma Gandhi. Okay. With the result that when an American sees that the VDEM democracy ranking for India is 108th out of 179 countries, that its freedom of press rating is I think it's 170th out of 180, 160th out of 170 countries, 10 from the bottom. Why should they doubt it? Right? There's a lack of information about India. In fact, most of our India debate is dominated by about half a dozen Indian intellectuals who write for major American newspapers. Now, they're either Indian or they're Americans or British people of Indian origin, but it's really striking that when you read American news articles and commentary about India, 9 times out of 10, the name on the article is an Indian name. When I read commentary and news articles about China, 9 times out of 10, the name on the article is a Western name. So our knowledge of India is not being driven by experts. Is not being driven by objective, uninvolved experts, dispassionate experts. Our China analysis, yes, completely driven by China experts. Our India analysis is driven by Indians with subjective points of view. They may be experts, they may be very knowledgeable. However, someone who says, when I visit my family every year, this is what I experience in India, this is what my friends tell me, that's not objective analysis. That's extremely subjective. In fact, I was recently at the Aspen Security Forum in the United States this northern summer. Interestingly, there was a China panel followed immediately by an India panel. The China panel had on it 5 top American experts about China. One was, I think the moderator was British, and the 4 experts were American. All Western, none of them of Chinese origin. They were all people who studied China, and they talked about China from the perspective of a lifetime of study. By contrast, the India panel was chaired by a Pakistani American and had on it 4 Indians, not Americans of Indian origin, actual Indian citizens. Now, I don't mean to malign Indian citizens. I have nothing against Indian citizens, obviously. Whatever that panel was, it was very informative, it was very interesting. It could never be objective. More importantly, it demonstrates the paucity, the lack of knowledge we have of India. That when a major American institution puts on a China panel, they get 5 non-Chinese experts. When they put on an India panel, they get 5 people whose family origins or their personal lives are in South Asia, 4 of them in India, 1 from Pakistan. Right? That's really telling. Our knowledge of India is not objective. It is subjective, and it comes from India itself. Where it doesn't come from India, it often comes from international Islamists. So Al Jazeera is a major source of information about India in the West. It comes from missionaries. So American and British missionaries who go to India and return and tell community groups about India, again, are very interested. It comes from human rights organizations, which have their own interests. Almost all of our knowledge of India is not driven by objective study of dispassionate individuals. It's driven by people with an agenda. Whether that agenda is right out in the open, as for a missionary or an international Islamist activist, or if that agenda is more internalized. Either way, it is highly subjective. Countering these narratives, I must say the Indian government does a very poor job of it. I know that Dr. Jaishankar is extremely popular in India. He is in many ways, he's certainly very articulate, but he is not very effective at public diplomacy. He may be very effective at diplomacy proper. I have no idea what goes on in closed rooms. But his position in public diplomacy has been almost every case to respond to criticisms of India by saying, how dare you criticize India? You have human rights problems of your own. It's none of your business. instead of coming to the table and saying, here are the data about India. I'd like to educate you about India. And it's the same with Mr. Modi himself. Mr. Modi, when asked questions about India, does not answer with positive information about India. Instead, he tends to answer by saying, it's none of the world's business what India does inside its own borders. Now, those kinds of approaches may be perfectly reasonable, and I'm not criticizing them for being unreasonable. I'm pointing out that they don't counter the criticisms that India receives internationally. Look, the solution here, if you want to do something about it, is to improve the world's knowledge of India. Of course, I'm doing my small part to do that. I really enjoy learning about India and talking to Westerners about India. It's great to talk to Indians, but I view my role as much more important when I'm talking to Westerners about India. I really enjoy being an educator, but I would encourage all of you to do the same. That is, the more people outside India really know about the country, the more likely it is that they'll find reasonable approaches to understanding India. And I think that's something that would be better, not only for India, but for the entire democratic world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Babones, for this insightful talk. Made probably all of us chuckle and exasperate, listening to how you uncovered these so-called international rating agencies and what all is going on. It's just fascinating. It was really, really insightful, very educative, very informative. I invite and welcome questions. We already have one question from Dr. Pillai, my colleague at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla. His question is, actually, let me try to make everybody talk on their own. So let me allow to talk. There is a feature here, so they can ask their own questions, I think, directly. And Dr. Pillai, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm from the University of Texas at Arlington, and my question was, I know Dr. Salvatore Babones talked about so much about the Indian, the opinions about the Indian democratic, state, but my question was: is the opinion of the Indian academics so skewed and so critical about India because the Indian academics in a way have been colonized? Do they have a, there was this very famous writer once upon a time who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. He talked about the colonized mind. Is it something like that they are also colonized, that they just forget to look at the objective part using data, like we are all educated to do that as political scientists and social scientists? Is that one of the reasons too?
I think that's a tempting interpretation, but not one that's ultimately correct. And I say that by taking a comparative perspective. So if I look here in Australia, the Australian Political Science Association, or the members of the Australian Political Science Association, the political scientists in Australia, are convinced that Australia is a fundamentally racist country that is unwelcoming to immigrants, that has not only repressed its indigenous people, but the emerging consensus in academia is that Australia has committed a genocide of its indigenous population. And in fact, the Journal of Genocide Studies is full of articles by Australian academics accusing Australia of being a genocidal society. And we can see similar criticisms in the United States of American democracy, American racism, American institutions, American indigenous genocide. I think it's in the character of academic political science that most people who go into the field go into it because they're highly critical of the political institutions in which they're brought up. Now, I'm not excusing that. I'm not saying that's correct. In fact, I'm very critical of those viewpoints. But the fact that Indian political scientists are highly critical of India does not surprise me when I find that Australian political scientists are very critical of Australia. The fact that they're highly critical doesn't, to me, suggest a colonialized mindset or anything unique about India. The problem comes when you combine that subjective criticism of one's own society with the structure of the international surveys. So the structure of the international surveys is such that when the American or the Australian political scientist criticizes his or her own country's institutions, they're doing so within a context that the basic ground rules are accepted. That is, the ground rules of politics in Australia are accepted. It's at the margins we find these criticisms. In India, there's not necessarily such an acceptance. So while an American or an Australian political scientist may rate their country a little worse, so for example, Australia ranks much worse on press freedom indices than do and English-speaking countries in general. I'm sorry, Anglosphere countries in general rate much lower than European countries. In fact, I think the press is freer, and I think democracies are of higher quality in the Anglosphere countries. Yet we in the Anglosphere, and including India here, are very critical of our institutions, whereas people in places like Sweden and Denmark are perhaps not so critical of their institute, or Japan, are not so critical of their institutions. So, when you combine, I understand the point, and I understand that India's political scientists are rating India worse than Australia's political scientists are rating Australia. But nonetheless, I think the basic phenomenon is there, that in all of our very robust democracies, political scientists tend to be highly critical. I don't think that's a phenomenon of coloniality or a colonial mindset.
Thank you.
Great, super. Anybody else? Any other question? Even Sanchari, being a fellow sociologist.
There is one more question in the chat.
Yes. Could you read, Sanchari, please?
Yeah. Jayant is saying, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I have a question. You have outlined several ways in which international democracy rankings, particularly VDEM, might be flawed, or their methodology might be put to question. Can you explain why there is nevertheless a uniform or nearly uniform slide across the board, across nearly all rankings for Indian democracy in the last decade? For instance, even in the Economist Democracy Index, which is determined by Western experts, not Indian intellectuals, India's ratings since 2019 have been the lowest ever since the ratings began. That is since 2006. Example, this rating was 7.68 in 2006 and 7.92 in 2014, and it is 7.04 today and had fallen to 6.61 2 years ago.
Right. So I think what we see here is a kind of bias that results when we live in an information-free environment. So I'm going to answer this question with an example from a different field, because people can dispassionately think of things in fields outside their own. I study international university rankings. It's something I've also published on. And the international university rankings that come out from Times Higher Education Supplement and Quackerly-Simmons send surveys to academics like me, asking me to rate universities in the world based on their research. Okay, fine, that's published. I might be able to do it. But they also ask me to rate universities around the world based on their teaching. And I'm supposed to say which university anywhere in the world has the best quality teaching. Now, of course, I have no way to know which university's best quality teaching. It may be Flame University for all I know. I've never sat in a class in Flame University. I don't sit in anybody's classes. How do I know? Well, I have to go to either news reports, or better yet, I go to the rankings. How do I know who's a good teacher? Well, I Google top universities for teaching, and Google tells me what rankings have told me. So inevitably, the Economist rankings are going to be influenced by the news stories that are coming out from the VDEM rankings. And I think the fact that the Economist rankings have fallen the least, the Freedom House rankings have fallen a little more, and the VDEM rankings have fallen the most. And specifically, what's fallen in VDEM has been the subjective evaluation of freedom of expression. I think all of this tends to reflect a reinforcement of bad news story comes out, people read the bad news story, they report it back on the rankings. So Reporters Sans Frontières rates India, says that India no longer has any kind of free press at all. I mean, India is one of the 10 most repressive countries in the world for its press. Now, no one who's read the Indian media can take that seriously, that one of the most 10, I mean, China, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and India, are the countries that have the most repressed press freedom in the world. Yet, because somebody reports something negative, and then somebody reads something negative and reports to themselves. So how does the Indian intellectual know that India no longer has freedoms, and those freedoms have declined since 2014? Well, the Indian intellectual knows, not so much because of any objective knowledge, but anything that's subjective is inevitably coming from what you're reading that other people have said subjectively. So there's this reinforcing, there's this self-reinforcement of these negative subjective feelings that ultimately will feed into all understandings of India. That is what Pew Trust survey. So again, I've got a question here in the chat about the Pew Trust surveys. I'm actually not sure what the Pew Trust surveys say about India. I know that our Pew surveys that I've worked with, that is the Pew surveys about freedom in India, report very high levels of freedom in India, but that's not freedom of the press. So that's a different thing. Okay. What I'm trying to say here is that it's very difficult to ascertain the origins of a subjective evaluation. What I can tell you as a statistical social scientist is that all of the deterioration in India's rankings can be attributed to subjective evaluations of India, mostly arising, that is, the worst subjective evaluations are coming from the surveys that originate in India. That may be true. That's for you to decide. I'm not telling you the rankings are wrong. I'm telling you that I think they lack face validity, and that you yourselves have to judge whether a subjective evaluation that India no longer has press freedom, you have to decide whether that's true or not true. I find it highly incredible. That is not credible, but it's subjective. So who knows? My main message to you is about the charisma of statistics, that you should not take this number as reflecting an objective truth merely because it's a number. In fact, the number is equivalent to asking somebody to subjectively rate their feeling on a scale from 1 to 10. The fact that I rate my feeling as a 2 does not mean that it's objectively 2. It means that my subjective evaluation has been attached to a number.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Pillai, you want to ask your question again? You can unmute yourself. Anyway, we can read probably. He's asking, do you think India should have a clearinghouse for information? Once upon a time, Voice of America did that. Yeah, that's the question.
Look, of course, India has Doordarshan, right? And there is a clearinghouse for information, or Press Trust of India and such. The problem is that those don't have very much reach outside India. So the issue here is not the information. The issue here is the reach of that information. That's a difficult circle to square. I'm not sure how to do it. When I spoke, and I did have the honor of meeting Mr. Modi for 15 minutes when he visited Sydney, and our conversation was entirely about data infrastructure. And I strongly encouraged him not to go down the propaganda route, but instead to go down the data route. That is, if the Indian government produced more objective data about India, then we wouldn't have to rely so much on these subjective evaluations. And I can give you one example. All of the data about journalist deaths in India comes from a journalist NGO called, Reporters Sans Frontières uses data from the, I'm sorry, I'm going to blank on the name of the NGO that produces the data on deaths of journalists. Okay, that NGO collects data systematically for the whole world and then writes its report. In its report, it says things like that India had more journalists killed than in any country outside China. And that's not exactly false. It is true. But of course, India has more people of every kind. And it has more people with black hair than any country outside China. When you actually calculate the rate of journalist deaths in India, it is actually relatively low. It's lower than in the United States. It is lower than in any other major region of the world outside of Western Europe. Well, if India were producing that data, then when reporters came upon it, instead of having to report, instead of getting a press release from a crusading NGO, they would get an official database produced by the government. And I'll use as an example of how the government could do that. It could be collecting data on violence against journalists. That would be great. But for example, India produces data on lynchings. And lynchings are, they exist in India. They're about 100 a year, 90 to 100 lynchings a year. You can go to a government database, you can get the data on it. And those have been much less controversial because we have hard data showing that they occur at a low level, that they're not increasing. And because you have the data, you can try to manage it down by improving law enforcement in India to get better results there. Well, you have that data for lynchings. Could we get that data on other things? Could we get that data for perceived freedom of religion? Could we get that data on reports of discrimination against people based on their religion or based on their based on their jati? Right? I'd love to have systematic data about India. I believe that systematic data would show India in a good light, but if the only people producing the data are activists who want to show show India in a negative light, those are the data we have to use. And those are the data that news organizations will report.
Very good. Yes. Anybody else? Any other question? We have taken. Okay, Sanchari, go ahead, please.
So I actually wanted to know, you told us about expert opinion and a knowledge expert. So what would be the difference between the two while the data is being collected?
Yeah. So, for example, the free and fair elections component, clean elections component, I'm sorry, of the VDEM is not based on expert opinion. It's based on expert knowledge. So the expert is asked, have there been incidents, reported incidents of people not being, of disputes about the electoral roll? And the expert can say, yes, the electoral roll is frequently disputed, is occasionally disputed, is rarely disputed, is never disputed. Has there been violence at the polls? More than 5% of polls are affected by violence, between 1% and 5%. Fewer. So the expert is being asked for knowledge about the elections, but is not being asked for a judgment about the elections. Now, when it comes to freedom of expression, the expert is being asked, how free are people to express their own opinions in India? Government repression is severe, government repression is occasional. Well, that's completely, not only is that completely subjective, it's also something you can't possibly have data on. I mean, literally, political scientists are asked on the VDEM to tell us how often the government suppresses the reporting of a news story. Now, how would you know if the government's I mean, you have no basis on which to know that your evaluation is a pure subjective instinct, which may be correct. I mean, I can't know whether it's correct or not. That's what distinguishes an objective from a subjective of expert opinion. The objective expert opinion could be wrong, but we could go to the data and find out that it's wrong. And it's likely to be right. I don't actually question the expert knowledge. I question the expert opinion that gets incorporated into VDEM and other surveys.
Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, we thank you, sir, and thank you again for your time and insights, and we look forward to having you more and more collaborations also. And by the way, this is just want to show you my university's campus. So let me increase the screen size. This is my university. You're most welcome wherever you're in India, and we look forward to more collaborations. Thank you and namaste.